The clock struck exactly 3:15 in the afternoon when Sarah and Michael walked through the doors of the orphanage for the last time, not as prospective parents, but as a complete family. Little Tommy, just 3 years old, tightly held Sarah's hand as he walked between the two, his hesitant steps revealing a mix of fear and hope that only a child on the brink of a major change could express. Sarah, a 35-year-old literature teacher, had her brown hair pulled into a messy bun, the result of hours of anxiety and preparation. Her green eyes, usually bright and joyful, carried the weight of years of failed attempts at motherhood. Michael, 2 years older, maintained his strong executive posture, but his restless hands, constantly adjusting his tie, betrayed his nervousness. The journey to this moment had been long and painful. 5 years of failed attempts to have a biological child, countless medical consultations, and the crushing weight of disappointment with each negative test had tested the limits of their 12-year marriage. Sarah still remembered the day when, after another letdown, Michael held her hands and whispered, "Maybe our child is already somewhere, just waiting for us to find him." Those words echoed in her mind for months as she struggled to accept that her body would not carry a child. The nights were the hardest, when the silence of their apartment seemed to scream the absence of baby cries and children's laughter. Michael tried to be strong for her, but Sarah sometimes caught him gazing lost at the empty room they had planned to turn into a nursery. The decision to adopt wasn't easy. Sarah had to first accept that her body wouldn't bring a life into the world, a process that involved tears, therapy, and long late-night conversations with Michael. He, in turn, carried his own baggage of guilt and inadequacy, questioning whether he could be a good father to a child who didn't share his blood. The adoption process itself was an emotional roller coaster. Months of assessments, home visits, psychological evaluations, and an endless array of forms to fill out. Each step brought a new wave of anxiety and anticipation. Sarah kept a meticulously organized folder with all the necessary papers, obsessively consulting it every night, fearing she had forgotten something crucial. The first meeting with Tommy was magical. He was sitting alone in a corner of the orphanage yard, quietly playing with a crumpled paper airplane. His large brown eyes lit up when Sarah approached and asked if she could join him. Michael watched from a distance, his heart melting as he saw how his potential son responded to his wife's affection. The apartment they called home had been carefully prepared for Tommy's arrival. The room, once an office filled with reminders of their failed attempts to start a family, was now painted in soft shades of blue and green, with small airplanes decorating the walls, an idea inspired by the boys' fascination with all things that flew. Sarah had spent weeks organizing every detail, from choosing the cloud-patterned bedding to selecting the children's books that filled the small bookshelf. "We'll give him a bath as soon as we get there," Sarah had planned during the car ride, her voice trembling slightly with emotion. "It helps with the adjustment, that's what the psychologist said." Michael nodded in agreement, his eyes shifting between the road ahead and the rearview mirror, where he could see Tommy holding the small teddy bear they had given him the day they met. The traffic was particularly heavy that afternoon, as if the universe wanted to test the patience of the new family one last time. Tommy remained surprisingly calm throughout the entire trip, only occasionally pointing at a plane flying across the sky above them. Sarah seized each of these moments to start small conversations, gradually building a connection with her new son. When they arrived home, Tommy timidly explored each room, his large eyes taking in every detail of the new environment. Sarah and Michael watched him with smiles on their faces, their hands intertwined, silently sharing the joy of the moment. The boy lingered longer in the room that had been prepared for him, gently touching each airplane on the wall as if he couldn't believe they were real. "Bath time, champ," Michael announced gently after giving Tommy enough time to familiarize himself with the space. Sarah had already filled the bathtub with warm water and some floating toys, rubber ducks and small boats that sailed across the surface. The soft scent of baby soap filled the bathroom, creating a cozy atmosphere. It was during the bath that everything changed. Michael was helping Tommy undress when his fingers froze mid-motion. There, on the boy's lower back, was a crescent-shaped birthmark, identical to his own, which he had carried since birth. Time seemed to stand still, and the air in the bathroom grew suddenly heavy. The world seemed to pause for a moment. Michael felt the blood drain from his face as a long-buried memory violently surged into his consciousness. Alice, a co-worker with whom he had a brief affair 4 years ago, during a crisis in his marriage. The affair he never told Sarah about, the secret he swore he would take to the grave. It had been a turbulent time in their marriage, when the failed attempts to have a child had created a chasm between him and Sarah. Alice was new at the company, understanding and attentive. What started as comforting conversations over breakfast turned into late dinners and, eventually, one night that Michael had spent the last 4 years trying to forget. "Are you okay, honey?" Sarah asked, noticing his hesitation. "You look pale." Michael forced a smile, but his heart hammered against his chest so loudly that he feared Sarah might hear it. "Yeah, just a little tired," he managed to reply while his mind frantically calculated the dates, the possibilities, the devastating consequences of what that simple birthmark might mean. Tommy played obliviously in the bathtub, making his little rubber ducks dive and resurface in the warm water, while the world of the adults around him began to silently crumble. Michael looked at his son, his biological son he now suspected, and at his wife who was smiling sweetly at the boy, completely unaware of the storm that was about to devastate their lives. The birthmark was like a living secret etched on Tommy's skin, a truth that threatened to destroy not only Michael and Sarah's marriage but also the happiness they had so carefully built over the last few months of the adoption process. Michael knew he needed to find out the truth, but he also knew that this discovery could cost him everything he held dear. That night, while Sarah put Tommy to bed in his new room, reading him a story about a little airplane that was afraid to fly, Michael sat alone on the apartment's balcony, his hands trembling as he held the phone. Alice's number was still etched in his memory, even though they hadn't spoken in years. He needed to know. He needed to confirm his suspicions before guilt completely consumed him. The sound of the city outside seemed distant and unreal, as if Michael were trapped in a time bubble where only he and the crushing weight of his secret existed. The light in Tommy's room went out, and he could hear Sarah softly humming a lullaby. The domestic scene, which should have brought peace to his heart, only intensified his anguish. His fingers hovered over the phone's keypad, ready to dial the number that could change everything. The question that tormented him was, how much of today's happiness was he willing to sacrifice for the truth of the past? The phone rang 3 times before a female voice answered on the other end of the line. "Hello?" Alice's voice sounded exactly as Michael remembered, soft, yet with a note of strength that had always intrigued him. "Alice? It's Michael." His voice faltered slightly, and he had to clear his throat before continuing. "We need to talk." A heavy silence settled on the line for a few seconds. "Michael, it's been a long time." The surprise in her voice was evident. "Is something wrong?" Michael closed his eyes, gathering his courage. From the next room, he could hear Sarah finishing getting Tommy ready for bed. The sound of his wife humming a lullaby to his potential biological son was like a knife to his heart. "Alice, I need to ask you something important." It's about a child." Michael hesitated, his voice barely a whisper. "Did you have a child after we separated?" The silence on the other end of the line was deafening. Michael could only hear Alice's irregular breathing as if she too was struggling with her own emotions. "Why are you asking this now?" Her voice trembled slightly. "Please, Alice, it's important. Did you have a child?" "Yes." The answer came as a whisper, almost inaudible. "Yes, I had a son." Michael's world began to spin. He leaned against the balcony railing, his legs suddenly too weak to support him. What happened to him? Michael could barely form the words. I couldn't raise him alone at the time. My career was just starting and my family. Alice paused, taking a deep breath. "I gave him up for adoption." Michael's heart stopped for a moment. "Does he have a birthmark? In the shape of a crescent on his back?" The sound of something falling on the other end of the line was followed by a gasp of surprise. "How do you know that?" "Alice, I need to see you. Tomorrow. It's urgent." The conversation ended with a hasty agreement to meet at a neutral cafe, away from the prying eyes of acquaintances. Michael hung up the phone and stayed on the balcony, watching the city lights as his mind tried to process the magnitude of what he had just discovered. Sarah appeared in the doorway of the balcony, wearing her favorite robe and a tired but happy smile on her face. Tommy finally fell asleep. He's so happy with his new room. Michael felt his stomach churn with guilt. Sarah came up to him and hugged him from behind, resting her head on his back. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you for not giving up on our dream of having a family." Each word was like a needle in his heart. Michael covered her hands with his own, trying to absorb the warmth and love that radiated from his wife, knowing this could be one of the last times they'd share such a moment. The next morning, Michael made up an excuse about an important work meeting. Sarah was busy organizing breakfast for Tommy, making little shapes with the pancakes to make the boy smile. The domestic scene was so perfect it hurt. The cafe chosen for the meeting was in a busy commercial neighborhood. Michael arrived first, choosing a table in the back of the establishment. His fingers nervously drummed on the coffee cup he couldn't bring himself to drink. Alice arrived on time as always. The years had been kind to her. She still had the same elegance that had first drawn him to her. Her eyes, however, carried a weight Michael didn't remember seeing before. "You found him, didn't you?" Alice got straight to the point, sitting down across from him. "You found our son." Michael nodded slowly. "My wife and I, we adopted him. Yesterday was our first day with him." Alice covered her mouth with her hands, tears beginning to form in her eyes. "Oh my God, Tommy. That's the name I gave him. Why didn't you ever tell me?" Michael's voice was thick with restrained emotion. "You knew he was my son and never said anything. What was I supposed to do, Michael?" Alice shot back, her voice a tense whisper. "You were married. Happy. That night was a mistake, we both knew it. When I found out I was pregnant..." She paused, wiping away a tear. "I decided it would be better for everyone if I just disappeared." "Better for everyone?" Michael struggled to keep his voice low. "You had my son and gave him up for adoption without giving me the chance to know him, to be part of his life. And what would you have done?" Alice asked, her eyes locked on his. "Would you have left your wife? Taken on a child born from an affair? Or would you have tried to keep two worlds separate, living an even bigger lie?" Her words hit him hard. Michael knew she was right. At the time he probably would have done exactly what she feared. But now, "Sarah doesn't know, does she?" Alice asked gently. Michael shook his head. "No. And now, how can I tell her? How can I tell her that the son we just adopted, the son she already loves more than anything, is actually the product of my betrayal?" "You need to tell her," Alice said firmly. "The truth is going to come out one way or another. And the longer it takes..." "It will destroy her," Michael interrupted, his voice breaking. "It will destroy everything we've built. But keeping this secret will destroy you," Alice replied. "And eventually it will destroy your marriage anyway. The truth has a way of finding its way into the light, Michael." They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of unspoken words hanging between them. The coffee grew cold in the untouched cups, while the noise of the cafe seemed distant and unreal. "What are you going to do?" Alice finally asked. Michael ran his hands over his face, feeling the weight of years of secrets and lies. "I don't know. But I can't lose my family. I can't lose Sarah. And Tommy? He deserves to know the truth about who he is." "He's only 3, Michael argued. "He's just started calling us mom and dad." "But he's going to grow up," Alice insisted. "And one day he'll ask questions. About his birthmark, about his biological parents. What are you going to say then?" Michael had no answer for that. His phone vibrated, a message from Sarah asking if he'd be home in time for lunch. The profile picture showed her and Tommy smiling, a selfie taken that morning. "I have to go," he said, standing up abruptly. "Please don't do anything. Don't tell anyone. I need to think." Alice nodded sadly. "Just don't take too long, Michael. Some truths can't wait forever." Michael left the cafe feeling more lost than when he entered. The weight of the secret seemed even heavier now that it had been shared. On his way home, he stopped at a park, needing a moment to compose himself. He watched the families around him, parents playing with their children, couples holding hands, the simplicity of the happiness he had just yesterday. How could a single birthmark have the power to destroy all of this? His phone vibrated again, another message from Sarah. "Tommy's asking for you. He wants to show you how he organized all the little planes we gave him." Michael stared at the message for a long time, feeling the tears he'd held back during the entire conversation with Alice finally begin to fall. Somewhere between guilt and fear there was a growing love for Tommy, not just as his adopted son, but as his biological son. A love that now threatened to destroy everything he held dear. Sarah noticed the change in Michael as soon as he stepped through the door of their apartment. There was something different in his eyes, a shadow she didn't recognize after so many years of marriage. He hugged Tommy tightly when the boy ran to greet him, and Sarah noticed his hands trembling slightly. "Was the meeting okay?" she asked casually as she served the lunch she had prepared. Yeah. Just normal," Michael answered distractedly, his eyes fixed on Tommy who was playing with his food, making little airplanes with his fork. The rest of the day passed in a fog of forced normality. Michael tried to act natural, but every interaction with Tommy now carried a new weight. Every smile from the boy, every innocent gesture, seemed to scream the truth he was struggling to hide. That night, after Tommy had gone to bed, Sarah found Michael sitting on the edge of their bed, staring at an old photo on his phone. "Who's that?" she asked, leaning over his shoulder. Michael quickly closed the app, but not quickly enough. Sarah had recognized the woman in the photo. Alice, Michael's former co-worker who had left the company a few years ago. Why are you looking at pictures of her? Sarah's voice was calm, but there was a note of concern that Michael knew well. I ran into her today, Michael began, feeling his heart race. At the cafe during the break from the meeting? Sarah sat next to him, her body tense. And why didn't you tell me? It didn't seem important at the time. He lied, hating every word that came out of his mouth. Important enough for you to keep a photo of her? Sarah stood up, beginning to pace the room. Michael, what's going on? It was at that moment that Tommy started crying in the next room. The sound cut through the apartment like a physical reminder of what was at stake. Sarah started to go to him, but Michael stopped her. I'll go, he said, needing a moment to compose himself. In Tommy's room, Michael found the boy sitting on the bed, silent, tears streaming down his face. I had a nightmare, Tommy whispered as Michael sat beside him. Want to tell me about it? Michael asked softly, running his hand through his son's hair. His son, he thought with a pang in his heart. I dreamt that you were leaving, Tommy said, his voice small and frightened. Like the others? Michael felt his heart break. He knew Tommy was referring to the previous adoptive parents who had given up on him during the adjustment period. The fear of abandonment was deeply rooted in the boy. We're never leaving, Tommy, Michael promised, pulling the boy into a hug. You're our son now. Forever. The words came naturally, but each one weighed on his conscience. He was promising eternity while keeping a secret that could destroy everything. When he returned to the bedroom, Sarah was sitting in the same position, but her face had changed. Years of failed attempts to get pregnant had honed her intuition for subtle shifts in Michael's behavior. There's something you're not telling me, she said. It wasn't a question. Michael sat in the chair in the corner of the room, unable to stay close to her at that moment. Sarah. Is it about Tommy? She asked, her voice trembling slightly. Are you regretting the adoption? No. The response came quickly and sincerely. It's not that. It's complicated. Then explain it to me, Sarah insisted, standing up and walking towards him. We've been married for 12 years, Michael. We've been through so much together. What could be so terrible that you can't tell me? Michael looked at his wife, the woman who had stood by him through the worst storms, who had never given up on them even when everything seemed lost. And now he was about to destroy everything they had built. Tommy's birthmark, he started, his voice almost a whisper. Did you notice it's the same as mine? Sarah frowned, confused by the change in subject. Yes, I noticed. It's an interesting coincidence, isn't it? It's not a coincidence, Michael said, the words coming out as if they were being ripped from his throat. Sarah, I had an affair. With Alice. 4 years ago. The silence that followed was deafening. Sarah took a step back as if she had been slapped. What are you saying? She asked, though her face already showed that she had understood. Tommy is my biological son, Michael finally confessed, the tears he had held in all day finally falling. Alice had him and gave him up for adoption without telling me. I swear I didn't know, Sarah. I swear I didn't know until I saw the birthmark yesterday. Sarah staggered to the bed, sitting down heavily. Her face had lost all color, and her hands were visibly shaking. So today, you didn't go to a meeting. You went to meet her. Michael nodded, unable to speak. How long did it last? Sarah asked, her voice strangely calm. It was just one night, Michael replied, knowing that this didn't lessen the betrayal in any way. It was during that difficult time when nothing was working with our attempts to have a baby. No, Sarah interrupted sharply. Don't you dare use that as an excuse. I was suffering too, Michael. I was broken too. But I didn't betray you. She abruptly stood up, walking over to the closet and starting to pull clothes out randomly. What are you doing? Michael asked, alarmed. Packing a few things. I can't stay here tonight. I can't look at you right now. Sarah, please, Michael pleaded, standing up to try and stop her. Think about Tommy. He just had a nightmare about being abandoned. Don't use our son against me. Sarah shouted before lowering her voice, remembering that Tommy was asleep in the next room. Your son, she corrected bitterly. Your biological son, the one you had with your mistress while I cried every night for not being able to give you a baby. The words hit Michael like daggers. Sarah tossed some clothes into a small bag and walked to the door. I'm going to my sister's house, she announced, her voice trembling. I need to think. I need to process all of this. Sarah, please, Michael tried again, but she was already leaving. Take care of Tommy, she said, stopping at the door. Don't let him notice that something's wrong. He's been abandoned too many times already. With that, she left, closing the door softly behind her. Michael stood in the middle of the room, feeling his world crumble around him. From the next room he could hear Tommy's soft breathing, unaware of how his life had just changed drastically once again. Michael sat on the edge of the bed, holding a photo of his wedding with Sarah that was on the nightstand. The happiness on their faces now seemed like it belonged to other people from another life. He had destroyed everything: his marriage, Sarah's trust, the stability Tommy so desperately needed. And the worst was yet to come. He knew that at some point he would have to face the legal consequences of his discovery. Tommy's adoption could now be questioned, as his biological father had been identified. The fear of losing not just Sarah but also Tommy began to consume him. The next morning dawned gray and cold, mirroring the mood that hung over the apartment. Michael hadn't slept. He had spent the night alternating between checking on Tommy and staring at his phone, waiting for a message from Sarah that never came. At breakfast, Tommy noticed something was wrong. His big, curious eyes searched for Sarah, but he didn't ask any questions. Michael saw how the boy ate his pancakes without enthusiasm, the shapes no longer fun like Sarah used to make. Mom went to visit Auntie, Michael explained when he couldn't bear the questioning look any longer. She'll be back soon. Tommy simply nodded, pushing the plate away. Michael's heart tightened as he realized how the boy had already learned to not ask too many questions, to quietly accept the absences in his life. At work, Michael couldn't focus. His secretary had to remind him 3 times of the same meeting, and he barely registered the worried expressions of his colleagues as he passed them in the hallway, oblivious to everything. His phone remained silent except for a short message from Sarah. "I need more time." It was during lunch when he received the call that would change everything again. It was from the law office responsible for Tommy's adoption. "Mr. Thompson," the lawyer's voice sounded serious on the other end of the line. "We need to schedule an urgent meeting. There have been developments regarding Tommy's adoption." Michael felt his stomach drop. "What kind of developments?" "I'd rather discuss this in person. Can you come to the office this afternoon?" 2 hours later, Michael was sitting across from attorney Diana Parker, a middle-aged woman with a serious expression. On her desk, there was a folder with Tommy's adoption documents. "We received an interesting call this morning," Diana began, adjusting her glasses. "From Tommy's biological mother." Michael felt the blood run cold in his veins. "Alice?" "Yes," Diana confirmed, raising an eyebrow. She revealed disturbing information. "Mr. Thompson, did you know you're Tommy's biological father?" "I found out recently," Michael admitted, his voice weak. "That's a serious problem," Diana continued, her tone professional but clearly concerned. "The adoption process has specific protocols when one of the adoptive parents is, in fact, the biological parent. There are legal and ethical issues involved." "What does that mean?" Michael asked, though he feared the answer. "It means the adoption can be challenged. In fact, it already is. Ms. Cooper, Alice, is claiming her maternal rights." Michael stood up abruptly, his chair screeching against the floor. "She can't do this. She abandoned him." "Technically she can," Diana explained patiently. "Especially since she claims she wasn't informed that the child's biological father was involved in the adoption. This could be seen as a significant omission in the process." "But I didn't know," Michael protested. "How could I have informed anyone about something I didn't even know myself?" "The problem is that now she's questioning not just the adoption, but also demanding shared custody." Michael collapsed heavily back into the chair, feeling as if the air had been sucked out of his lungs. "And Sarah? What happens to her rights as an adoptive mother?" Diana hesitated for a moment. "Is your wife aware of this situation?" "Yes," Michael replied, rubbing his face with his hands. "I told her last night." "And how did she react?" She left the house," Michael admitted. "She's at her sister's place." Diana sighed deeply. "Mr. Thompson, I'll be frank with you. This is an extremely complicated situation. If your wife decides to contest the adoption because of your omission about your previous relationship with the biological mother, things could get even more complex." "She wouldn't do that," Michael said, but his voice betrayed his uncertainty. "Don't underestimate the impact of a betrayal discovered like this," Diana warned. "I've seen similar cases where the outcome was unpredictable." Michael felt the weight of his past choices crushing him. "What can I do?" "For now, stay calm and don't make any rash decisions. I'll arrange a meeting with all the involved parties, you, your wife, Ms. Cooper, and their respective lawyers. We need to find a solution that prioritizes Tommy's well-being." As Michael left the office, he checked his phone again. A new message from Sarah. "I need the adoption documents. My lawyer wants to review them." Her lawyer. The words hit Michael like a punch to the stomach. Sarah wasn't just thinking, she was preparing for a legal battle. On the way to pick up Tommy from daycare, Michael stopped at a park. He sat on a bench, watching the families around him. Parents playing with their children, couples chatting, scenes of a normalcy that now seemed like another life. His phone rang again. It was Alice. "Why did you do this?" he asked as soon as he answered, his voice trembling with contained anger. "I had to do something, Michael," Alice responded, her voice steady. "After our conversation yesterday, I can't just ignore that my son is so close. He's my son too." "He's Sarah's son," Michael retorted. "She loved him from the first moment, not knowing any of this. How could you?" "And I loved him enough to know I couldn't raise him on my own back then," Alice replied, her voice cracking. "But things have changed. I've changed. And now that I know he's with you—" "You're going to ruin his life," Michael interrupted. "He finally has a family, stability, love. And you want to take all of that from him because of your feelings of guilt?" The silence on the other end of the line was deafening. "Think about Tommy," Michael continued, his voice softer now. "He's been through so much. Please don't do this to him." "I am thinking about him," Alice answered after a moment. "I'm thinking he deserves to know the truth about who he is, about his biological parents. And he deserves the chance to meet me too." Michael hung up the phone, feeling more lost than ever. The sun was beginning to set, painting the sky with orange hues that seemed to mock the darkness inside him. When he finally arrived at daycare to pick up Tommy, the boy ran into his arms with a smile that made his heart ache. How could he protect his son from a storm that he himself had created? "Dad," Tommy said as they walked to the car, "when is Mom coming back?" The innocent question carried the weight of every wrong decision Michael had made. "Soon, son," he answered, praying it wouldn't be another promise he couldn't keep. "Soon." Sarah sat in the lawyer's office, the weight of the past few days pressing down on her shoulders. Richard Carter, a family law attorney, was examining the adoption documents with meticulous attention. "Technically," he began, removing his glasses, "we have a strong case to challenge the adoption. Your husband withheld crucial information, even if unintentionally." "I don't want to contest the adoption," Sarah interrupted, her voice firm despite the visible dark circles under her eyes. "I want to protect my son." "Mrs. Thompson, you need to understand the complexity of the situation," Richard explained gently. "With the biological mother claiming rights and your husband being the biological father, your rights as an adoptive mother may be severely compromised." Sarah closed her eyes, remembering Tommy's smile on that first morning at the orphanage. "He's my son," she whispered. "It doesn't matter what a DNA test says." Sarah's phone vibrated, another message from Michael. "Meeting with all the lawyers tomorrow at 10 a.m. Please come. We need to sort this out as a family." Family. The word now had a bitter taste. That night, alone in the guest room at her sister's house, Sarah found an old photo in her purse, her and Michael on the day they met Tommy. The happiness in their faces seemed to belong to another life. Rebecca, her sister, entered the room with a cup of tea. "Tommy asked about you today," she said softly. "Michael called me." Sarah felt the tears she had been holding back begin to fall. "How is he?" "Confused. Scared. Michael said he's not sleeping well." "I should be there," Sarah whispered. "Then why aren't you?" Rebecca asked, sitting beside her. "Because every time I look at Tommy now, I see Michael's betrayal. I see Alice. And I hate myself for it, because he's just an innocent child who has nothing to do with any of this." Rebecca embraced her sister as she cried. "What do you really want, Sarah?" "I want my son back. I want my family back. But I don't know if I can forgive Michael. And now, with Alice wanting custody—" "You're the only mother Tommy knows," Rebecca reminded her. "Don't let your anger at Michael destroy that." The next morning the law office was tense. Michael arrived first, followed by Alice and her lawyer. Sarah entered last, avoiding looking at any of them. Diana Parker, the adoption attorney, began, "We're here to discuss the situation of minor Tommy Thompson." "Dawson," Alice interrupted. "His birth name is Thomas Dawson." Sarah felt her stomach turn. Michael, sitting on the other side of the table, looked equally disturbed. "The issue," Diana continued, "is determining the best interest of the child." "He has the right to know his origins," Alice's lawyer argued. "Mrs. Cooper is in a stable position now, capable of being part of her son's life." "He already has a mother," Michael said, looking directly at Sarah. "A mother who isn't even living with him at the moment," Alice retorted. Sarah stood up abruptly. "You don't have the right, you abandoned him." "I protected him," Alice shouted back. "I protected him when I couldn't raise him. But now I can." "Enough." Diana's voice sliced through the air. This isn't a competition. We're talking about a child who's already been through enough trauma. The silence that followed was deafening. I propose a deal, Diana continued. The adoption remains valid, with Mrs. Thompson retaining her maternal rights. Mrs. Cooper can have supervised visits, gradually if Tommy shows interest and comfort. And what about me? Michael asked, his voice breaking. That, Diana replied, will depend on your wife's decision regarding the divorce. Sarah felt the world spin. The word divorced hung in the air like a sentence. I need to see my son, she said suddenly. Now. He's at daycare, Michael informed her. I can take you there. Sarah nodded, ignoring the lawyer's protests. Some decisions had to be made with the heart, not the law. On the way to the daycare, the silence between her and Michael was as heavy as lead. Years of love and trust reduced to a deafening emptiness. I'm sorry, Michael whispered, his hands gripping the steering wheel. For everything. Sarah didn't answer. Her silent tears said everything words couldn't express. Tommy was playing in the sunny playground when Sarah and Michael arrived. The boy was running between the colorful swings, his blue uniform slightly stained with crayon, evidence of another creative morning in the art room. Upon seeing them together, his brown eyes lit up with such pure hope that it broke both their hearts. He immediately abandoned the toy he'd been playing with and ran toward them, his tiny feet barely touching the ground, throwing himself into Sarah's arms. Mommy? You're back, he exclaimed, burying his face in her neck, his little fingers clutching her blouse as if afraid she might disappear again. Sarah hugged him tightly, breathing in the familiar scent of his children's shampoo mixed with the aroma of crayons and morning snack cookies. Silent tears ran down her face as she held her son. Yes, her son, no matter what the DNA tests or legal documents said. I've missed you so much, my love, she whispered into his soft hair. Mrs. Martinez, the teacher, approached with a gentle smile on her lips. She was a middle-aged woman who had witnessed many family dramas in her 20 years of teaching. He asked for you every day, she commented softly. Especially at nap time. Sarah felt her heart tighten even more. She was the one who always put Tommy to sleep, singing his favorite song about stars and airplanes while brushing his hair until he fell asleep. Michael watched the scene from a respectful distance, his hands restless in the pockets of his suit, his own heart shattered by the intimacy he had risked destroying. Every suppressed sob from Sarah, every joyful laugh from Tommy felt like a needle in his conscience. Look, Mommy! Tommy suddenly exclaimed, wriggling in Sarah's arms to point at a mural on the wall. I made our family. The drawing was pinned among dozens of other children's works, but it stood out for its touching simplicity. 3 stick figures, one larger wearing a tie, Michael, one with long brown hair, Sarah, and a smaller one in the middle, Tommy, all holding hands beneath a smiling sun. Small airplanes flew across the blue sky of the drawing, and in the lower corner, Tommy had tried to write his name in crooked, uneven letters. It's beautiful, my love, Sarah managed to say, her voice thick with emotion. Her fingers lightly traced the simple lines on the paper, representing her family, a family that, despite all the complications and lies, was real in Tommy's heart. Can we go home now? Tommy asked, his big eyes fixed on his mother's face. All together? I've arranged all the little airplanes in my room just like you like. Sarah looked at Michael, who seemed just as lost as she did. The lump in her throat seemed to grow with every passing second. How could she explain to a 3-year-old that their family was falling apart? How could she make him understand that sometimes love isn't enough to keep people together? Tommy, Sarah began, kneeling down to his level, adjusting the collar of his uniform shirt with automatic motherly gestures. Sometimes adults need some time to sort things out. Like when I'm grounded? He asked innocently, fiddling with Sarah's necklace, a gift from Michael on their last wedding anniversary. Sarah stifled a sob, remembering the day she received that necklace, the promises of eternal love that now felt so distant. Something like that. But I want you to know something very important. No matter what happens, I will always be your mom. Always. And Dad? I will always be your dad too, champ, Michael replied, his voice hoarse with emotion, finally coming closer and kneeling next to Sarah. The familiar scent of her husband, ex-husband, made Sarah flinch slightly. It was at that moment that the daycare door opened with a soft creak and Alice walked in. She had followed Michael's car, determined to see her biological child. Time seemed to freeze, and the air grew suddenly heavy with unresolved tension. Alice was elegant in her navy blue suit, her high heels echoing on the ceramic floor of the daycare. Her eyes, the same color as Tommy's, were fixed on the boy with an almost painful intensity. Tommy, sensing the sudden tension in the air, clung tighter to Sarah, hiding his face in her neck. It was remarkable how young children could feel the emotions of adults, even without fully understanding them. Alice took a step toward them, but Michael intercepted, placing himself between her and his family. His posture was tense, protective. "No," he said firmly, his voice low but full of authority. "Not like this. Not now." "He's my son," Alice whispered, tears starting to form in her perfectly made-up eyes. "I have the right?" "No," Sarah interrupted, standing up with Tommy in her arms. Her voice trembled with contained emotion, but her words were firm. "He's my son. I've been there for every nightmare, every fever, every smile. I know what flavor of ice cream he likes, I know he's afraid of thunder, I know he can't sleep without his little blue airplane. Where were you?" "Please," Mrs. Martinez intervened, noticing how Tommy had started trembling in Sarah's arms. "Not in front of the child. He's already been through too many changes." Alice took a step back, then another, the reality of the situation finally hitting her. Tommy was clinging to Sarah as if his life depended on it, his small fingers leaving white marks on her shirt. "I want to go home," he whimpered, his voice small and frightened. Sarah looked at Michael, then at Alice, and made a decision. In that moment, seeing her scared child, all her doubts and hurts seemed to fade in the face of the need to protect him. "Yes, my love. Let's go home. All of us." Tommy asked hopefully, lifting his head from Sarah's shoulder to look between her and Michael. Sarah took a deep breath, looking directly at Michael. Years of love, trust, and now betrayal passed silently between them in that glance. "Yes, we all need to talk." On the way to the apartment, Tommy fell asleep in the back seat, rocked by the gentle movement of the car and emotionally drained. Sarah drove, with Michael sitting beside her in silence. Through the rearview mirror, she could see Alice's car following at a respectful distance. "He deserves a family," Sarah finally said, breaking the heavy silence that had settled between them. "A real family." "We are his family," Michael replied, his voice heavy with regret and hope. "Are we?" Sarah asked, her hands gripping the steering wheel until the knuckles turned white. "A family built on lies?" "Built on love," Michael corrected softly, risking a glance at her. "What I did was terrible, unforgivable. But the love we have for Tommy is real. The love I feel for you, even if you don't believe in it anymore, is real too." Sarah parked the car in front of the building where they lived. In the rearview mirror, Tommy was still peacefully sleeping, his face relaxed in slumber, unaware of the drama unfolding. His favorite teddy bear, a gift from Michael the day they met, was tightly hugged against his chest. "We'll fix this," she said finally, her voice softer now. "Not for us but for him." Michael nodded, feeling a small spark of hope light up in his chest. Alice parked her car on the other side of the street, waiting for a signal to approach, her presence a constant reminder of the complexity of the situation. The moment of truth had arrived. It was time for all the masks to fall, for all the secrets to come to light. And at the center of it all, innocently asleep in the backseat of the car, was a little boy who just wanted his family back. The apartment was silent when they entered. Sarah carried Tommy, still asleep, to his room, while Michael and Alice waited in the living room, keeping an uncomfortable distance between them. Tommy's little airplanes were scattered on the floor, just as he had left them on the last morning when the family was whole. Sarah returned to the living room after settling Tommy, softly closing his bedroom door behind her. Her eyes were red, but her posture was firm. "We need to set some rules," she began, sitting down in the farthest armchair. "For Tommy?" Alice nodded nervously, her hands fidgeting in her lap. "I don't want to destroy his life. I just want to be a part of it." "How?" Sarah asked. "Do you want him to know he's adopted? That you're his biological mother? He's only 3. "We can wait," Alice suggested, her voice softer. "Start slow. Maybe as a family friend?" Michael, who had remained silent up until then, finally spoke up. "And what happens when he's older? When he starts asking about his birthmark? Then we'll tell him the truth," Sarah replied, surprising everyone. "But at the right time, when he can understand." A soft cry came from Tommy's room, interrupting the conversation. Sarah stood up automatically, but Alice moved as well. "Let me go," Sarah said firmly. "He knows me. He chose me as his mother long before we knew anything about any birthmarks." Alice stepped back, tears in her eyes. "You're a good mother," she admitted. "Better than I could have ever been back then." Sarah paused in the hallway, turning to look at Alice. "And now? Are you ready to be a mother now?" "No," Alice replied honestly. "Not in the way he needs." but I'm ready to be part of his life if you'll allow it." Tommy's cry grew louder and Sarah hurried to his room. Michael and Alice heard her soft voice soothing the boy, singing the same song about stars and airplanes that she always sang. "She's extraordinary," Alice whispered. "Yes," Michael agreed, his heart heavy. "And I almost destroyed it all." When Sarah returned, Tommy was in her arms, still sleepy but calmer. His eyes widened when he saw everyone in the living room. "Who are you?" he asked, looking curiously at Alice. Alice swallowed hard, looking at Sarah for guidance. Sarah gave a slight nod. "I'm a friend of your parents," Alice replied, her voice trembling slightly. "I heard you like airplanes." Tommy's face lit up. "Do you want to see my collection?" Sarah set Tommy down, watching as he ran to fetch his airplanes. Michael approached her hesitantly. "Can we try?" he whispered. "For him?" Sarah looked at her husband, the man who had betrayed her trust, but also the father Tommy adored. She looked at Alice, who was genuinely smiling as Tommy showed off his airplane collection. "Yes," she finally answered. "But with some conditions." In the months that followed, a new routine was established. Alice visited on Sundays, always bringing a new airplane for Tommy's collection. Sarah and Michael began couples therapy, slowly working to rebuild the trust that had been lost. What an incredibly moving story. The journey of Sarah, Michael, Alice, and Tommy is a reminder that family isn't just about blood ties, but about choices, forgiveness, and unconditional love. Throughout it all, we see that the true strength of a family lies in its ability to reinvent itself, learn from its mistakes, and heal past wounds. The evolving relationship between Sarah and Alice, which once seemed impossible, shows how love and understanding can create new possibilities, even in the most difficult circumstances. When it comes to Sarah's decision, it's hard to judge what would have been right or wrong in such a delicate situation. She chose what was best for Tommy, allowing him to be surrounded by love, and that is, without a doubt, a courageous and selfless choice. In the end, what truly matters is the positive impact on the child's life, and Tommy seems to be surrounded by genuine love from all involved. Now, we'd love to hear your thoughts, dear viewers. Do you think Sarah made the right choice in allowing Alice to be part of Tommy's life? How would you have handled such a challenging situation? We're eager to hear your perspectives. Don't forget to leave your comments, like the video, and subscribe to the Life Stories channel. Your support helps us continue bringing more emotional and inspiring stories like this. See you next time.